Europeans, let's talk about immigration. Because it feels a little embarrassing that the tricks that are being used to divide us today are the same lazy and unimaginative tricks that have been used in the past, and often same tricks that have been used on populations that have existed within living memory. Because one thing you need to realize that as capitalism reaches its final fascist stage, as more countries throw off the yoke of imperialism and Western capital cranks the wrench on its people, a lot of the proletariat Westerners, in other words, the poor and middle-class whites, who once found shelter and comfort in whiteness and in empire, are starting to feel the economic and social squeeze of their nation's capitalistic belligerents, and like clockwork, have begun to fall for the old tricks of blaming the other: black people, Muslims, Mexicans, and immigrants. And it's rather disappointing because history never stops. The story of us, humans, as a species and as an evolving society is cyclical. It is now, it is always, and it is forever. See, the world is becoming a difficult place to exploit. New global powers are rising, and geopolitical events around the world are putting a squeeze on the Western imperialist nations. The war in Eastern Europe and West Asia has siphoned billions of dollars from the economies of the imperialist West. They've caused major agricultural disruptions in Israel and Ukraine that have led to billion-dollar revenue losses, as well as grain and produce shortages. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline by the US to not only cut revenues from Russia, but also to ensure that Germany and Europe do not achieve energy independence outside of the control of US corporations, has led to soaring energy prices in Europe, which has translated to expensive heating and the closure of multiple industries as products built on the continent have become non-competitive on the global market. The Houthis have disrupted strategic trade routes, leading to maritime diversions and an increase in transportation cost of goods heading to the north. And the AES alliance in the Sahel region, responsible for gold and mineral resources that were lighting up at least 1 in 3 bulbs in France, have expelled the colonizers and taken control of their resources. The US economy is losing revenue from the continued divestment of international trade, from both the dollar as an international currency and from the SWIFT international transfer system. Besides the rising cost of doing business due to the disruptions of war, Western capital has also lost what investments it did have in Russia, Israel, and the Sahel, at the same time as they have had to increase their defense budgets in preparation for a war they believe they must undertake to retain their global hegemony. If you are to understand why white people are suddenly feeling an abnormal economic squeeze, why rent and mortgages are through the roof, why they are crying in their cars from working 2 or 3 jobs, why groceries have become unaffordable, why private equity has gone into the landlord business, buying up private residences, critical infrastructure and family farmsteads across the world, why grocery stores are experimenting with surge pricing, why CEOs of corporations are in sudden fear for their lives, and why governments in the West seem powerless to stop this transfer of wealth from an already impoverished working class to some of the wealthiest people in the world. It is exactly because of all the things I have just listed. Because even in peacetime, capital seeks only increasing profits. And as capital bleeds and continues to find resistance to its singular aim of exponential growth, it throws off its mask of respectability and becomes increasingly imperialist and more openly fascist. Because it will always be much easier to militarize your police force and quell dissent than it would be to increase minimum wage and stop imperialist wars that would go against the wishes of corporate donors who fund your politicians' lifestyles and their political campaigns, and who own all the businesses that hold up the economy. It is easier to deploy propaganda against an out-group rather than bend to legitimate cause for equity amongst your indigenous working population. And so the immigrants, the Muslims, black people, and the Mexicans are on the chopping block again. Europe has gone fascist. There have been televised attacks on immigrants and people of color in Britain and across Europe. And in the West, Trump has come to power on the backs of demonizing immigrants and the promise of mass deportations as soon as he gets back into power. It seems the people have not learned, despite how many times humanity has gone through this circle, that we are engaged in class warfare rather than a strong struggle that is delineated along race, religion, or gender. Divide and conquer is a trick as old as time. Stoke as many lines of dissent as possible within the local and international proletariats. Flood the social space with an overload of misinformation. Fund all the sides of the divides. Pay for narratives that will struggle to find organic birth. And then sit back and fish from the muddled waters. It is a transparent but effective tactic. And while anti-immigrant riots are being documented currently in a state like Ireland, you could literally go back 30 years and find videos taken in England where the Irish themselves were considered the invading immigrants. There is only one statistic you need to know to understand the immigration problem of Western economies, and that is the population replacement fertility rate needed by any group of people to function as a self-sustaining and self-replicating society. That number is 2.1. And when you compare that number with fertility rates of almost all Western societies, you understand how the wool has been pulled over your eyes, and yet you've been fighting a losing battle at least since the late 80s. Because to sustain the Ponzi scheme of capitalism that needs an ever-increasing population of employed youth and young people to take care of those who are exiting the workforce, and to guarantee the almost infinite growth capital requires from corporations and its investments. And lastly, if you must measure the health of your economy by the GDP, the gross domestic product, then at the very least you must have a self-sustaining and self-replacing population. And to exacerbate matters, Western economies have gained an outsized portion of the global economy, growing disproportionately wealthy from the looting and plundering of wealth and mineral resources from the global south, that they have run up against a brick wall, which is that there is simply a limit to physical opportunities to get a return on the available capital. Ask yourself, what do economies like France and Britain, with less than 70 million people and a minimal manufacturing base, what they are producing to be the world's 6th and 7th largest economies? The answer is nothing. Much of their GDP comes from the loot and plunder from coercive resource agreements with the corrupt elites and the ruling class of their so-called former colonies. This excess capital sloshing around in the West is what led to the invention of finance capital and the casinos of Wall Street, Hong Kong, and Canary Wharf, which is why the proletariat uprising that was supposed to spell the end of capitalism was pushed down the road, and why projects like the metaverse and the digital space are becoming a necessity, because they are literally trying to increase the landscape of investment possibilities. This excess capital also means that with the collapsing birth rates in the West, there are simply not enough people to work that capital. And if the local population is not going to give birth to the future workers and consumers, then it must get them from outside your border. And a uniform decline in birth rate across the continent usually means immigrants from the non-white countries of the global south. And to be clear, the machine of capitalism does not need these people to be highly skilled. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it actually prefers them not to be. That way it can actually use them to undercut the entire wage structure of the local economy. Also, apart from workers, capitalism simply needs more consumers. In its cheap labor-seeking, profit maximization drive masked as globalism, Western economies have outsourced their manufacturing abilities and deindustrialized, making them largely service-based economies with a need of enough people who will consume goods and services. It needs people to buy the cheap goods they produce overseas, the food from their fast food chains and grocery stores, to pay rent in their properties, to take out mortgages at their banks, to pay taxes, and to take out credit cards. The hypercapitalism of the West is a direct result of this deindustrialization, and is a consumption-based system that simply cannot thrive without a young, healthy, and growing population. All the right-wing leaders who have ever used immigration as a wedge issue, they know this, which is why even after getting elected to office, they still seem incapable of stopping the boats and of monitoring fences, which they could absolutely do, I promise you, if they wanted. And this is why, even with anti-immigrant sentiment sweeping across Europe, Germany, with its 1.4 fertility rate, is still trying to woo Indian students and professionals, which is why investors in the UK and Canada are facing revenue collapse and closures as their governments try to balance the material realities of capitalism and a protectionist cultural pushback from the local population. This is the contradiction of the system that you have built. that you have cheered on because we've normalized these cold, inhumane, exploitative, and transactional relationships that the average poor, rather than denounce the system that exploits him, will protect it, for he hopes to use it to exploit others in the future. What these poor souls forget is that capitalism does not recognize or care about culture. In these unique circumstances created by the capitalist system of Western economies, it's become a zero-sum game. It's either profit maximization or it's cultural preservation. You can't have the extremes of both. You must find a balance or a compromise. You must either tax the billionaires and use some of that hoarded wealth to create the economic conditions needed to foster procreation, or you allow them to squeeze you to the point where it's become too expensive to even have children, to replenish and sustain your population. And the same billionaires then bring in the migrants to supplement this your dwindling population. Because let me be clear, it is done. The population of the Northern Hemisphere have suffered a population collapse. At this point, any attempts at cultural preservation by restricting immigration will lead to a slow but sure submission to economic ruin, like Great Depression era ruin. You are fighting a battle today that was lost in the 80s, and it will be foolhardy to allow any politician to tell you otherwise. But this is the world that you chose, right? Because at the core of your problems today is that cliche poem. First they came for the Jews, then the communists, and then the trade unions. You get the point. Because you refuse to find community with the global south, to see the humanity in people who do not look like you. You fail to recognize our oneness and our connectedness, even as your leaders wage economic and military war on the global south. The uranium from the AES, from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is processed through 56 nuclear reactors to light 1 in 3 bulbs in France. And yet there isn't a single nuclear reactor in the Sahel after almost 60 years of so-called independence and continued partnership with France. As I speak in 2025, through post-colonial agreements, France still receives almost $500 billion from at least 10 of its former colonies annually. This is how France has the 7th largest economy in the world, with less than 70 million people, and at best a mid-aviation and wine export industry. Your cities are literally built with our wealth, a literal giant pipe sucking the resources from the south and depositing them in the north. Your comfort is enabled by the blood of our ancestors, and your consumption is facilitated by the rape, murder, and exploitation of our children. There is an overt, traceable correlation between a starving African child you like to flash on your TVs and the craft dinner you are able to put on the table for Johnny and for Alice. A line that runs straight through the barbarism and savagery of your leaders and your foreign policies. Did you question the source of this outside wealth? Did you inquire about the source of these riches? No. You basked in the excess and thought yourself exceptional. You call us savages who couldn't build cities, even as you assassinated our leaders, attacked our allies, and undermined our progress. The thing is, though, is that the modern world and the system that underlie it, however, are not separate from universal law and from the principles of balance and equilibrium. Because if you pile one side of a scale and keep piling it, eventually something is going to give. For 1,000 years, the North has raided and pillaged the South. You've built your wealth on the murder of people, the theft of resources, and the destruction of civilizations. And you have piled all the spoils and the luxuries that they afford you in the cities of the Northern Hemisphere. Now, if the wealth of all the world and the living conditions they afford are concentrated in one hemisphere, then eventually the people, if they can't get access to decent living conditions using their own resources and in their own lands, then they will use the very means of extraction and move to where they can get access to those resources and that basic level of human dignity. Either that or the South will one day revolt, throw off your yoke of colonialism, rebalance the scales of distribution, and plunge you into a poverty and desperation that you can only begin to fathom. Because as James Baldwin says, the world will change because it has to change. This is inevitable. And so the immigrants coming into your countries and threatening to overwhelm you with their doggedness, their work ethic, and their remarkable virility are coming for this exact reason. They are fleeing your country's brutal foreign policy that exploits them and robs them of their dignity, and they are finding shelter, paradoxically, in the imperial core, in the wealth and stability of the nations that do them harm. The West and its populations are the architects of their own cultural demise. The governments with their foreign policy of fascist imperialism, and the citizens with their complicity and apathy, because if they had held their governments to account the many times that they could have, through the wars of colonization, the periods of slavery, Jim Crow, new colonialism, then the world might perhaps have achieved a peaceful balance of even development across the globe, with a fair trade of products and resources, and with a rich but limited social and cultural interaction. We would all have thriving cities and learning centers with foreigners a novelty to each. A visit from someone from some other lands will be occasions of excitement, as we will be eager to see what marvels that they've brought from their lands. We will travel for leisure, education, and cultural exchange, but we would all mostly be on our continents. The imbalance in the world that is causing these huge demographic shifts is because the West has tried to hold the scales in their favor by brute force, but equilibrium will always prevail in its own unexpected ways. And if Africans and South and Central Americans and Asians cannot use their resources to create hospitable living conditions where they can thrive, then they will seek out these living conditions in the cities that were built with the wealth stolen from them. They will flood your cities, and all of a sudden you'll find yourself competing with people hardened from a protracted lack, tough and resilient, who will work harder and longer for less pay, because your imperial policy of forcing their countries to devalue their own currency to maintain your power now makes it profitable for them to do so. And you who are baited in the spoils of excess and have forgotten what it is to really compete, since the oversupply of wealth has meant an outside compensation for an at best middling performance from mediocrity. And because capital is cruel and cares only about numbers, they will outcompete, outbreed, and overrun you without a shot fired, and they will come back into their inheritance. And even if you manage to pass the most draconian immigration control laws and deport all the first generation and third generation immigrants, and you're able to win all the current wars, it still doesn't solve the problem of your collapsed demographic. You simply do not have enough workers and consumers for your outsized wealth, and eventually capital will run out of ways to enslave you. Your population has collapsed. You will be down to 7 credit cards, 2 mortgages, reverse mortgages, council taxes, income taxes, prisons, tickets, and all the ways they've devised to keep you enslaved, that at the end of the day, capital will look over to the south and see this untapped human capital just a ready market to replicate the financial incarceration that they've perfected on you. And they're going to be like, hey, let's go build our hotels and our bridges over there and integrate these people into our financial systems. And at that point, capital will abandon you. Without the checks and balances of empathy, humanity, equity, and justice, the universe will resort to more violent and chaotic ways to find its equilibrium. But don't get me wrong, there are certainly ways that Europe can save itself, can preserve its cultural identity, and create the economic and social conditions necessary to recover its demographics. But it will only come after some serious self-reflection and at great sacrifice, which will involve implementing economic systems that you've been socialized to hate your entire lives. First of all, Europe will need to stop all its neo-colonialist belligerence and its imperialist campaigns of destabilization, so that the cities in the global south can experience stability and economic and infrastructural growth. Because I hate to break it to you, the north is pretty shit climate-wise, and no immigrant wants to leave the tropics for the cold and soulless Europe. The inability to loot the global south will make you significantly poorer, but that's okay. You will look inwards and you will find true ingenuity and innovation. Secondly, Europe, like the rest of the world, will probably have to undergo major economic reform, which may or may not involve scrapping capitalism, because capitalism is an economic system that's dependent on poverty, cheap labor, and doesn't give a damn about racial purity or cultural preservation. It only cares about consumers, workers, and profits. Your countries are overwhelmed because capitalism needs people to work for cheap. It needs people to consume the shit it produces and take out mortgages, loans, and credit cards. Europe is also going to have to find a way to distribute all the accumulated wealth, scrap the use of the GDP as a measure of the health of the economy, and prioritize the well-being of its people. And they will need to slow down life in general. An economy that prioritizes the health and well-being of its people is not an on-the-clock economy. A 3-day work week because the world will not collapse if that PowerPoint is not ready by 9 a.m. in the morning. More leisure and better wealth distribution will incentivize people to actually procreate. This is a mess that Europe has created for itself by its belligerence on the world stage, either as a willing accomplice or as vassals to the Anglo-American Empire. And yet it's a mess that is fairly easy to rectify. It's in your hands now. It's always been in your hands. Call your governments to order. Call them home from conquest and war. If they won't heed, replace them. Not just them, but a system of government that is based on the principle of divide and conquer, and an economy that is built on imperialism, plunder, and looting. Call them home. Trade a GDP of theft and pillage for the preservation of whatever is left of your culture, of the culture in your societies. If you do these things and innovate and find real value to trade fairly with all the nations of the world, you will be able to eventually recover your populations. Because trust me, no immigrant wants to be in your country, to live and settle in the north, outside of curiosity and a natural desire for adventure. It's really much nicer in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. And if you don't, without a doubt, you will continue to be overwhelmed with the number of people capitalism needs to thrive, and you will eventually be outbred and have to relinquish power in your own states, because the black and brown people of the global south will rise, and we will either rise contained on our continent, or we will rise by outbreeding you on your own continent. Or capital will eventually be done with you and move to the south, but we will rise. The meek will inherit the earth, or we shall destroy ourselves in nuclear fire. The monster ball is over. Call your governments home. The revolution is yours to do. It's always been yours to do. It might be a difficult proposition to contend with, but I promise you that a free and liberated global south is going to be key to the survival and continued existence of the Caucasian populations of the global north.